The city was almost asleep. Only the distant hum of cars and the glow of streetlights painted life into the empty night. High above the quiet streets, the top floor of Hale Tower still shone bright, a sign that work never stopped there, not even at midnight. Inside that tall glass office building, Mr. Richard Hale, the billionaire owner of Hale Enterprises, sat at his giant mahogany desk. The man who once built his empire from scratch now stared at a document that could make him even richer, a merger contract worth over $200 million. The air inside the office was heavy with tension. 3 men in suits sat across from him, his lawyer, Mr. Collins, and 2 business partners. They watched eagerly as Richard turned the final page. Collins leaned forward with a polite smile. "All we need now is your signature, sir. One stroke of the pen and your empire grows overnight." Richard smiled faintly. He was tired of meetings, tired of numbers, tired of people who only cared about profit. But this deal was special. It was supposed to secure his company's future. He picked up his golden pen, the one his late father had given him when he signed his very first deal. The pen had always brought him luck. At least that's what he believed. "All right then," he said quietly. "Let's make history." He placed the pen above the signature line, and then from the far corner of the room came a trembling voice. "Sir, please don't sign it." Everyone froze. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place, that for a moment no one spoke. The ticking of the wall clock grew louder. Tick, 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 echoing through the silence. Richard turned slowly. Near the door stood Maria, the night-cleaning lady. She was in her worn uniform holding a mop, her face pale and frightened. Her hands shook as she tried to speak again. "Please, sir," she whispered. "Don't sign that paper." For a few seconds no one understood what was happening. Then the lawyer frowned deeply. "What is the meaning of this? Who let her in here?" Maria took a small step forward. Her eyes were full of fear but also of determination. "I didn't mean to interrupt, sir, but I saw something earlier. Something wrong." "You shouldn't sign that contract." Richard blinked in disbelief. He looked around at his partners. They were already smirking. Mr. Collins chuckled softly. "Sir, she's clearly confused. Maybe she misunderstood something while cleaning." "Let's not waste time," but Maria didn't back away. "I'm not confused," she said firmly. "I heard them talking. Someone wants to trick you." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her words were sharp enough to cut through the room's silence. Richard set the pen down and leaned back. "What did you say?" I was cleaning near the meeting room," Maria stammered. "Earlier today, before everyone came in, I heard Mr. Collins talking to another man. They said something about hidden pages and extra words that you wouldn't notice." The lawyer's smile vanished. His eyes turned cold. "Sir, this is absurd. She's making up stories. She must be desperate for attention or money." Maria shook her head quickly. "No, I don't want money. I just want you to be careful." Richard studied her face. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, lines of exhaustion on her cheeks. But there was honesty in her expression. No greed, no motive. Just fear. The other partners shifted uncomfortably. One of them whispered, "Maybe we should escort her out, Richard." But Richard raised his hand. "Wait." He stood up slowly, walking toward Maria. His polished shoes tapped softly against the marble floor. "Maria, is it?" he asked gently. She nodded. "You're saying you overheard a private conversation about this contract?" "Yes, sir," she said, lowering her eyes. "I wasn't trying to listen. I heard words that scared me. I couldn't stay quiet." Richard looked back at Collins, who forced a chuckle. "Sir, please." "You can't take this woman seriously. She's a cleaner, not a lawyer. She doesn't understand business." But something inside Richard stirred. A memory of his younger days when he was poor too, working long hours and praying someone would listen. He turned to Maria again. "What exactly did you hear?" Maria hesitated. The room's air grew thick with silence. Even the sound of the wind outside felt distant. "I heard someone say, 'He'll never notice the added clause,'" she whispered. "And then Mr. Collins said, 'Once he signs, everything's ours.'" Collins shot up from his chair. "That's enough." "This is slander." Richard's eyes hardened. "Sit down, Collins." For a moment, no one moved. The power in Richard's voice froze everyone. Maria stepped back, afraid she'd gone too far. "I'm sorry, sir. I shouldn't have spoken." "Please don't fire me. Richard interrupted softly. You did the right thing. Her eyes widened. He looked back at the contract. For the first time, the neat lines of text didn't look comforting. They looked dangerous. He picked up the document and flipped through the pages. The ink shimmered under the fluorescent lights. Something about it felt off, but he couldn't tell what. Finally, he placed the papers back down. "This meeting is over," he said quietly. "Sir," Collins began, but Richard cut him off. "I'll review the document again tomorrow. Alone." Collins clenched his fists, trying to hide his anger. "As you wish," he said stiffly, gathering his things. As the others left the room, Maria stood frozen near the door. Richard walked over to her. "You've just caused a lot of trouble for yourself," he said softly. Maria's voice trembled. "I know, sir. But if I stayed silent, I wouldn't sleep tonight." Richard studied her again. She was poor, tired, invisible to most people in the building, and yet she had spoken up when no one else dared. He gave a small nod. "Go home, Maria. Get some rest." She nodded and left quietly, clutching her old mop like a shield. When the doors closed, Richard turned back to his desk. The golden pen still lay on the contract and untouched. He stared at it for a long time, the echo of Maria's words filling the room. "Don't sign it." For the first time in years, Richard Hale, the man who trusted no one, began to doubt the people closest to him. And as the city lights flickered below, a strange chill crept up his spine. Something told him that the cleaning lady's warning was not just a coincidence. It was a sign that the deal meant to make him richer. Might just destroy everything he'd built. The night wind outside howled against the glass windows of Hale Tower, but inside the building silence ruled. After the tense meeting, Maria Alvarez quietly returned to the janitor's storage room. Her hands still shook as she placed her mop back into the bucket. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since she had spoken up, since she dared to stop a millionaire from signing his deal. She had never spoken to Mr. Hale before, except for polite greetings in the hallway. People like her didn't talk to people like him. But tonight had been different. Something inside her told her she couldn't stay quiet. Maria leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Her reflection in the small mirror looked tired, the face of a woman who had carried too many worries for too long. Her uniform was old, her shoes worn out. Her eyes, though weary, still carried a spark of courage. She looked down at her phone. The time showed 12:47 a.m. If she didn't leave soon, she'd miss the last bus home. But her thoughts weren't on the bus. They were on the words she had overheard earlier that evening, the ones that had made her heart drop. It had been just a few hours before the meeting. Maria was cleaning the 11th floor conference room, humming softly to herself. It was routine work, wiping tables, collecting trash, straightening chairs. No one usually came that early. But that day she heard voices. At first she thought it was a normal business conversation. She didn't mean to listen, but when she heard Mr. Hale's name, she froze. "Everything's ready," said a deep voice. "The old man won't notice a thing. Once he signs, the shares move under our control." Maria paused, her hand still holding the trash bag. She recognized the second voice. It was Mr. Collins, Mr. Hale's personal lawyer. He laughed softly. "He trusts me completely. I drafted the new version myself. We just slipped in a few changes, harmless-looking words but legally powerful. He won't read them carefully. He never does." Maria's mouth went dry. Another man spoke. "So once he signs, we move the assets quietly. By the time he realizes, it'll all be too late." Collins replied, "Exactly. He'll think he's merging, but really he's giving us control. The papers look perfect." Maria's heart began to pound. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. These were important people, men in suits talking about betrayal as if it were just business. She pressed herself against the wall, afraid to move. If they saw her, she could lose her job. She had already been warned twice about being too slow at her work. One more complaint and she'd be fired, but then she thought of her daughter, Elena, lying at home coughing in her sleep. Elena was only 8 years old, with asthma that got worse every winter. Maria worked extra hours to afford her medicine. If she lost this job, she didn't know how they would survive. Yet she also couldn't forget what she had heard. She whispered a prayer under her breath. "God, what should I do?" By the time the meeting started that night, Maria was still unsure. She had tried to convince herself to stay silent. "It's not my business," she muttered while sweeping the hallway. Rich people do strange things. I just need to work. But her conscience wouldn't let her. When she saw Mr. Hale sitting at his desk smiling proudly, surrounded by men who were secretly planning to betray him, she felt a deep ache inside. Her own husband had once been cheated the same way, tricked by his business partner. Morning light poured through the tall glass windows of Hale Tower, but the mood inside Richard Hale's office was anything but bright. The night's conversation still echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. "Sir, please, don't sign it." He hadn't slept. The golden pen still sat on his desk, right beside the unsigned contract. His reflection in the window looked older than usual. Weary eyes, a furrowed brow, a hint of guilt he couldn't quite explain. For the first time in years, the confident, powerful Mr. Hale was unsure. He turned the pages of the contract again, reading every word carefully. The text was dense, filled with legal jargon. To most people it looked perfectly normal, but something felt off. Some phrases seemed slightly different from what he remembered seeing earlier drafts. Still, he couldn't be certain. Was it possible that his trusted lawyer, Mr. Collins, had betrayed him? He didn't want to believe it. Collins had been by his side for over 15 years, through every major deal, every victory. They'd even celebrated birthdays together. Why would he do that? Richard muttered to himself. There's no reason. There's just no reason. But the unease wouldn't leave him. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Maybe the cleaning lady had misunderstood. Maybe she'd overheard a different conversation. Still, her terrified eyes wouldn't fade from his memory. She hadn't looked like a liar. She had looked like a woman desperate to warn him, even though she had nothing to gain and everything to lose. At 8 a.m., the office started filling up again. Secretaries rushed in, phones rang, and meetings began as usual. Richard didn't speak to anyone. When Collins walked in with his usual smile, Richard forced himself to stay calm. "Good morning, sir," Collins said smoothly. "Did you get any rest? I imagine last night's interruption was unpleasant." Richard looked up slowly. "Yes, quite unpleasant." Collins laughed lightly. "Ah, well, you know how people can be. Some of the staff get curious about things they don't understand." Richard nodded faintly but said nothing. His sharp eyes watched Collins's every move. The man looked confident, almost too confident. He was humming softly as he poured himself coffee. "Should we go ahead with the signing today?" Collins asked. "The investors are expecting the announcement." Richard smiled, a thin, unreadable smile. "Let's hold off for a bit. I want to review the final document once more." The lawyer paused, the cup halfway to his lips. "Again? We've already reviewed it several times." "Yes," Richard said calmly, "but I want to be absolutely sure this time." Collins hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "Of course, sir. As you wish." He placed the folder back on the desk. Richard nodded and dismissed him with a polite gesture. But as soon as the door closed, his expression changed completely. The polite mask vanished. His jaw tightened. He pressed the intercom. "Samantha," he said to his assistant, "bring me the original draft of the merger agreement, Guy, the one we approved last week." "To make sure no one knows I asked." "Yes, Mr. Hale," came the reply. An hour later, Samantha entered the room with a brown folder. "Here it is, sir. Straight from the archives." "Thank you," he said quietly. "And Samantha?" "Not a word to anyone." She nodded nervously and left. Richard opened the folder and placed it beside the current contract. Page by page, he began comparing them. At first, everything looked identical. The same headers, the same structure. But then his eyes caught something. Page 7. A section titled Transfer of Assets had slightly different wording. In the new version, a single sentence had been added. "All operational authority and controlling shares shall be transferred to the secondary partner upon merger completion." Richard's hands went cold. He flipped back and forth between the pages. The sentence wasn't in the original. It had been inserted. If he had signed the new version, he would have unknowingly handed over his entire company. He sat back in shock, breathing heavily. The room felt smaller, darker. The truth hit him like a punch to the chest. Maria had been right. His own lawyer, the man he trusted most, had tried to ruin him. Later that afternoon, Richard stared out of his window at the city below. People walked on the sidewalks, cars honked, and life went on as usual. But for him, nothing felt the same. He thought of all the people who had pretended to care, who smiled in his face while waiting for a chance to take what was his. Was this what success brought? money, power, and betrayal. His thoughts wandered to Maria again, the poor woman who worked quietly in the shadows of his empire. She had seen what others missed. She had spoken when others stayed silent. He picked up his phone and called the HR department. "Find me the cleaning staff schedule from last night. I want to know who was assigned to the executive floor." There was confusion on the other end. Yes, Mr. Hale. That would be Maria Alvarez. She's been with us 5 years. Hard worker, no complaints. Richard paused. 5 years? Yes, sir. She's one of our most reliable employees. Works late shifts mostly. Thank you, he said and hung up. He sat in silence for a while. 5 years. All this time she had been working just outside his door, invisible, unnoticed. He felt a strange mix of shame and respect. That evening, when the office emptied again, Richard stayed behind. The golden lights of the city blinked below as he sat with both contracts spread out before him. He thought about confronting Collins right away, calling the police, firing everyone involved. But then he hesitated. If Collins had planned something this big, he might not be working alone. There could be others, hidden partners, silent investors, people waiting for him to make one wrong move. No, he decided. He had to be smart. He had to be quiet. He closed the folder slowly and whispered to himself, "You made one mistake, Collins. You forgot I didn't get here by trusting people blindly." Then he turned off the light, leaving only the soft glow of the city outside. As he walked toward the elevator, a single thought lingered in his mind. The image of a cleaning lady standing bravely in front of him, warning him when no one else dared. For the first time in years, Richard Hale didn't just feel powerful, he felt human. And as he stepped into the elevator, he made a silent promise to himself. He would find the truth. He would expose every traitor, and when he did, no one would see it coming. The next morning, Hale Tower was bright and busy, but behind its shiny glass walls, Richard Hale was already living a secret double life. To everyone else, he looked the same, calm, powerful, in control. But inside, his thoughts burned like fire. He knew the truth now. The contract he was about to sign wasn't a deal, it was a trap designed by his own lawyer, Mr. Collins, and perhaps others working in the shadows. Still, Richard didn't show it. He smiled at his staff, shook hands with visiting clients, and nodded through meetings. He had learned one thing in business: never show your cards until the time is right. That morning, while everyone thought he was reviewing financial reports, he was secretly reading something else, copies of every major contract Collins had handled for the past year. He went through them line by line, page by page, looking for patterns. And there it was, and hidden phrases, changed clauses, small additions that looked harmless but shifted power quietly. It wasn't the first time Collins had done this. It had been happening for months. The realization made Richard's stomach twist. How much had he already lost without even knowing? He clenched his fists. He wanted to storm into Collins's office right then and demand answers. But he stopped himself. If he moved too soon, Collins might destroy evidence or alert whoever was helping him. No, Richard needed proof. Solid proof. And for that, he needed help. That evening, when the offices had emptied and the halls were quiet again, Richard left his executive floor and took the elevator down to the service level, a place he had never visited before. The air there smelled of cleaning chemicals and soap. The floors were lined with grey lockers and mop buckets. A few staff members were finishing their night shift. They stared at him in shock, the company's billionaire owner, walking through the janitor's hallway like an ordinary man. He smiled politely. "I'm looking for Maria Alvarez." The workers pointed toward a small room at the end of the hall. Inside, Maria was folding clean rags, her back slightly bent, humming softly to herself. When she turned and saw him, she froze. "Mr. Hale?" she said, eyes wide. I didn't expect to see you here," Richard smiled gently. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, sir," she stammered. "I was just finishing up." He looked around the small, dimly lit room. The walls were plain, the air warm from the old heater in the corner. A photo of a little girl, smiling, missing her 2 front teeth, was taped to her locker. "Is that your daughter?" he asked. Maria nodded proudly. "Yes, sir." "Her name is Elena. She looks happy," Richard said softly. "You must be a good mother." Maria lowered her eyes. "I try my best." There was a long pause before Richard spoke again. "You were right," he said finally. Maria blinked. "Right?" he nodded. "About the contract. I checked it myself. There were hidden clauses, traps that would have destroyed everything." "You saved me," Maria gasped, covering her mouth. "Oh, thank God. I was so afraid you wouldn't believe me." Richard's expression softened. "I almost didn't, but I couldn't ignore the fear in your voice. You risked your job to warn me, and you were telling the truth." Tears filled Maria's eyes. "I only did what anyone should do." He shook his head slowly. "No, Maria, most people wouldn't have, especially when it meant risking everything." Friday arrived. The morning sun glowed bright over Hale Tower, but inside the building tension buzzed like electricity in the air. Everyone knew today was the big day, the day the contract would finally be signed. Investors were calling, partners were excited, and Mr. Collins, the company's trusted lawyer, moved through the halls with a confident smile. But only one man knew the truth. Richard Hale had been waiting for this day, not to sign the deal, but to end the game once and for all. He had spent the past few nights in silence, studying every word of the false contract, working with his private investigator to gather proof, and preparing one final move that would expose the lies. And by his side, quietly helping, quietly watching, was Maria, the woman everyone ignored until she became the one voice that mattered. At 10 a.m., the grand conference room was ready. A long glass table sparkled under the light. Expensive pens, crystal water glasses, and thick folders sat neatly in place. Everyone wore smiles, unaware that their smiles were about to fade. Collins stood near the window talking to two investors, the same men Maria had overheard days ago. "After today," he said with a smirk, "everything changes. Hale won't even realize what hit him." Maria, pretending to mop the hallway nearby, caught every word. She quickly sent a text to Richard's assistant as he had instructed. "They're ready. Everyone is here." Inside his private office, Richard adjusted his tie in the mirror. His reflection looked calm, but his pulse beat hard under his skin. Today wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth and respect. He took a deep breath and walked toward the conference room. The room fell silent the moment he entered. "Good morning, everyone," Richard said smoothly. "Let's make this a day to remember." Collins grinned. "Absolutely, sir. I've prepared everything for your signature." He handed over the contract, the same one he thought Richard hadn't reviewed. Richard sat down, opening it slowly. Page after page, his eyes moved with deliberate care. Finally, he stopped near the end and smiled. "Everything looks perfect," Collins nodded eagerly. "Then shall we proceed?" Richard picked up his golden pen. The room held its breath, but before signing he looked up and said softly, "Actually, there's something I'd like to clear up first." The lawyer blinked. "Of course, sir." "What is it?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Collins, do you believe in honesty?" The lawyer forced a small laugh. "Naturally, sir. It's the foundation of our business." "Good," Richard said, his tone calm but sharp. "Then you won't mind explaining why this contract has clauses that don't appear in the original draft." The room froze. One of the investors frowned. "What?" Collins stiffened. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean." Richard stood up, his voice cold now. "Don't play games with me, Collins. I compared every page. You added a sentence giving control of my company to your so-called partners." The lawyer's face turned pale. "That's ridiculous. Someone must have—" "Enough," Richard cut him off. "You've been altering documents for months. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" The investors exchanged uneasy glances. One of them whispered, "Collins, what's going on?" Collins stammered, sweat forming on his forehead. "Sir, there must be a misunderstanding." Richard slammed the folder shut. "No misunderstanding. I have the evidence right here." He turned toward the door. "Officer, you can come in now." The glass doors opened, and two detectives walked in, followed by a man in a grey suit holding a recording device. "This," Richard said calmly, "is Mr. Lane, a private investigator I hired 3 days ago. He's been listening, recording, and watching every meeting you've held." Collins's face drained of all color. "Yes, you can't be serious." Mr. Lane stepped forward, pressing a button on the recorder. Collins's own voice filled the room, the recording of him whispering to the investor earlier. "Once he signs, everything's ours." The investors' faces went white. One of them stood up. "You set us up, Collins. You told us he knew—" Collins turned red, his voice breaking. Wait, I can explain." But it was too late. The officers moved forward, reading him his rights as they cuffed his hands. Richard watched silently, his expression unreadable. He felt no joy, no triumph, only relief. The trap had worked. The truth was finally out. As the officers led Collins away, the room was filled with shocked silence. One of the investors turned to Richard. "Mr. Hale, we had no idea he was doing this. We're sorry." Richard nodded quietly. "I believe you. But next time, choose your partners more wisely." He gathered the papers from the table and handed them to his assistant. "Burn these. I want every copy destroyed." The investors quickly left, whispering nervously to each other. Within minutes, the room was empty again. Only Richard and Maria remained. She had stepped inside quietly after the officers left, clutching her mop nervously. "Is it over, sir?" she asked softly. Richard looked at her for a long moment, then smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "Yes, Maria, it's over. Thanks to you." She shook her head. "I didn't do much," he chuckled. "You did everything. If you hadn't warned me that night, I'd have signed that paper and lost my life's work." Her eyes filled with tears. "I just did what I thought was right." He nodded, his gaze warm. "Sometimes the right thing takes more courage than anything else." She smiled shyly and looked down. "I'm just glad you're safe, sir." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Maria, you saved more than my company. You reminded me what integrity really means." For a moment, the room was quiet, just the hum of the city below and the faint sound of Maria's breathing. Then Richard said softly, "Go home, Maria, rest, you've earned it." She nodded and left, wiping her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. As the door closed, Richard turned toward the window. The city stretched out before him, glowing, alive, and full of second chances. He took the golden pen from his desk and held it in his hand. For years it had been a symbol of power, but now it reminded him of something else. The night a poor cleaning lady stopped him from signing his own destruction. He smiled faintly and whispered, "You were right, Maria." Outside, the sky began to darken, and the city lights flickered one by one. For the first time in a long time, Richard Hale felt free. But deep down he knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because now that the trap was revealed, he had one last thing to do. Set things right. For Maria, for his company, and for himself. The next few days at Hale Enterprises felt strangely quiet. The gossip had faded. The news stories had slowed down. But whispers still traveled through the building. About Mr. Hale's lawyer being arrested, about the mysterious woman who stopped him from signing the deal, and about how everything changed in one night. Employees spoke in hushed tones near the elevators. "Did you hear?" The cleaning lady warned him. Unbelievable. How did she even know? They say he fired half his legal team after that. Maria heard the rumors, but she didn't say a word. She kept her head down, mopping floors, cleaning offices, doing what she always did. Only now people looked at her differently. Some smiled kindly, others whispered behind her back, but Maria didn't care. She wasn't there for attention. She was just grateful she still had her job. Every evening she returned home to her small apartment, where her daughter, Eleanor, waited with open arms. "Mom, are you okay?" the little girl would ask. Maria always smiled. "I'm okay, my love. Everything's going to be better now." She didn't know how true those words were. Not yet. 3 days after the confrontation, Maria was called to the top floor. When the receptionist told her, her heart skipped a beat. "Mr. Hale wants to see you," the woman said with a smile. Maria's first thought was fear. Did I do something wrong? She wiped her hands nervously on her apron and took the elevator up. The ride felt endless. Her reflection in the mirror walls looked small and anxious. When the doors opened, she stepped into the same hallway where just days ago she had begged him not to sign. A secretary greeted her warmly. "Mr. Hale is waiting for you." Maria nodded, clutching her cleaning rag like a shield, and slowly pushed open the office door. Richard Hale was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the city. The light of the morning sun reflected off the skyscrapers, painting the room in gold. When he turned, his face was calm, softer than before. "Maria," he said, smiling, "thank you for coming." "Of course, sir," she said quickly. I hope I didn't disturb you." He shook his head. "Not at all. Please have a seat." She sat nervously on the edge of the chair, clutching her hands in her lap. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Richard said quietly, "Do you know what everyone calls you now?" Maria blinked. "No, sir. They call you the woman who saved a millionaire." Her eyes widened. "Oh, sir, please. I didn't mean for anyone to—" He raised his hand gently. "You don't have to explain. I know you didn't do it for fame. That's exactly why I respect you." Maria looked down, embarrassed. "I just didn't want something bad to happen. I couldn't stay quiet." Richard nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that night, about how you saw what I couldn't, how you cared enough to speak up even though you were afraid. You risked your job, your safety, and maybe even your peace. People like you are rare, Maria." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "I just did what was right." He smiled softly. "And that's what true strength is." He walked to his desk, picked up an envelope and placed it gently in front of her. "This is for you." She hesitated. "What is it?" "Your new position," he said. "And something extra." A month had passed since that unforgettable night in Hale Tower. The night a poor cleaning lady changed a millionaire's life. In those few weeks, everything began to shift, quietly but powerfully. The company was no longer the same. The halls that once echoed with pride and greed now carried laughter, teamwork, and a strange new warmth. Richard Hale's once cold and distant reputation began to soften. He was no longer just the untouchable CEO. He had become something different, human. The transformation. Richard started spending more time walking through the building, not just to inspect, but to listen. He greeted his employees by name, asked about their families, and visited departments he had never stepped into before. He even walked down to the basement level one afternoon, where the cleaning staff worked. Everyone froze when they saw him enter. The room fell silent, but Richard only smiled. "I came to thank all of you," he said warmly. "You keep this company standing. From today, your team will receive better pay, proper health benefits, and better working hours. You deserve it." There was a stunned silence, then applause. Some even had tears in their eyes. In the corner, Maria watched quietly, pride swelling in her chest. When their eyes met, Richard gave her a small nod, the kind that said everything without words. Maria's new life, Maria's new role as administrative assistant to the CEO was more than just a promotion. It was a second chance. Her desk was near the top floor now, and her hands no longer held a mop, but a stack of reports and company files. She wore simple but elegant clothes, her hair neatly tied, her smile calm and confident. She was nervous at first, terrified she might make mistakes. But Richard's trust gave her courage. He often told her, "Maria, perfection isn't what I need. Honesty is." And she never forgot that. Every evening she would still take the bus home, but now she carried hope instead of exhaustion. Elena's health had improved too. Her new school had better care, thanks to the scholarship Richard had arranged. At night, Maria would sit by her daughter's bed, watching her sleep peacefully, whispering, "See, my love? Good things happen when we do what's right." Richard's redemption for Richard. Life was changing in quieter ways. He began donating large portions of his wealth to causes he once ignored: hospitals for children, shelters for the poor, and programs for single parents. But there was one cause closest to his heart, a new foundation he created in Maria's name, the Alvarez Hope Fund. It was dedicated to helping hard-working people who were overlooked: janitors, cleaners, drivers, and caretakers, those who made the world better but were never seen. When Maria first heard about it, she cried, "Sir, why would you name it after me?" Richard smiled. "Because you taught me that integrity doesn't wear a suit. It wears courage." A visit to the past one Sunday morning. Richard drove to the small church near Maria's neighborhood. It was quiet inside, wooden benches, sunlight streaming through colored glass, the faint sound of a choir practicing. He knelt in the back pew and closed his eyes. For the first time in years he prayed. Not for success, not for wealth, but for forgiveness. He whispered softly, "Thank you for sending her that night, for saving me from myself." When he opened his eyes, Maria was there, standing near the front, lighting a candle. She hadn't seen him come in. For a moment he just watched her, the woman who had changed everything with just a few trembling words. "Sir, please, don't sign it." He smiled and whispered under his breath, "You were my miracle." The celebration. A few weeks later, Hale Enterprises held its annual company event. This time, it was different. There were no expensive wines or showy speeches. Instead, it was simple, full of gratitude and warmth. Richard stood on the stage and looked at his employees, hundreds of faces smiling back at him. "I used to believe success was about power," he began. "But I was wrong. Success is about people, about trust, honesty, and courage." He paused, his voice growing softer. "A few months ago, I almost lost everything because I trusted the wrong people. But one person, someone everyone overlooked, had the courage to save me." All eyes turned toward Maria, standing shyly near the back of the hall. "She taught me what real strength looks like," Richard continued. "So tonight I want to honor her." He gestured toward her. "Maria Alvarez, will you come here, please?" The room erupted into applause as Maria slowly walked to the stage. Blushing deeply, Richard handed her a small golden plaque that read, "For courage, integrity, and heart, the true foundation of Hale Enterprises." Tears filled her eyes as the audience stood, clapping, cheering. She looked at Richard and whispered, "Thank you, sir," he smiled. "No, Maria, thank you." The final scene that night, after the event ended, Maria and Richard stood on the rooftop of the building. The city lights sparkled below like stars scattered across the earth. Maria sighed softly. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Richard nodded. "Yes, but you know what's even more beautiful?" She looked at him curiously, seeing how one act of kindness can light up an entire world. Maria smiled, her eyes glistening. "Maybe we were both meant to learn something that night." He chuckled. "Yes, you learned that your voice matters. And I learned that wealth means nothing without humanity." They stood there in silence for a while, the cool wind brushing against their faces. Then Maria said quietly, "You've changed, sir." He smiled gently. "No, Maria, you helped me remember who I was meant to be." As they both looked out over the glowing city, the camera would slowly pull back. The lights, the sky, the tower standing tall. A poor cleaning lady's courage had not only saved a millionaire, it had rebuilt a man's soul. And though life would move on, that single moment, that warning whispered in fear, would echo forever. "Sir, please, don't sign it." 10 years passed, the world had changed. New technology, new companies, new faces. But in the heart of the city, one tall glass building still stood proud, Hale Tower. It wasn't just a place of business anymore. It had become a symbol of something much greater, honesty, hope, and second chances. Inside its walls hung a bronze plaque near the entrance. It read, "In honor of Maria Alvarez, whose courage reminded us that truth has no price." Every employee who walked through those doors read that line each morning. It wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder of what the company stood for now. Maria's new path, Maria Alvarez, was no longer the quiet cleaning lady who hid behind a mop and a smile. She was now the head of community relations at Hale Enterprises, respected, confident, and loved by everyone. She had grown into a woman of influence, not because of power, but because of her heart. She used her position to help others like her, the forgotten, the unseen, the hard-working souls who built the world in silence. Through the Alvarez Hope Fund, she had helped hundreds of families get education, health care, and a chance to dream again. Every month she visited schools, hospitals, and shelters, always with a warm smile and a humble heart. Whenever people thanked her, she always said the same thing: "Don't thank me." I was just brave for one moment. That's all it takes, one moment to change a life. Elena's dream, her daughter, Elena, had grown into a bright young woman, now a university graduate with honors in business and social development. One sunny morning, Elena stood in the same conference room where her mother once begged a man not to sign a paper. Now she stood confidently before a group of young interns, giving her first motivational talk. "My mother once told me," she began, "that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when your hands are shaking." She smiled, her eyes glistening. And that one act of courage changed both our lives, and the life of a man who thought money was everything. Everyone clapped. Some even wiped away tears. After the talk, Maria came up to her, proud tears shining in her eyes. "You were wonderful, mija." Elena laughed softly. "I learned from the best." They hugged, standing in the same place where fear once filled the air, now replaced with hope and love. Richard's legacy. As for Richard Hale, he had grown older, his hair now silver, but his eyes still carried the same spark. He had retired from daily management, handing the company over to a new generation, one that grew up under his values. But every morning he still visited the building, greeting employees like old friends. The man who once measured life by profit now measured it by people. He had become something of a legend, the millionaire who was saved by a cleaning lady, and he never tried to hide that story. In fact, he often retold it in interviews, smiling softly as he said, "She taught me that the richest people are those who never stop caring." The reunion one warm afternoon, Richard invited Maria and Elena to his countryside home for lunch. It was peaceful, birds singing, sunlight pouring through tall oak trees. As they sat on the porch sipping tea, Richard looked at them with quiet affection. You know," he said, "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that night." Maria smiled gently. "Maybe you would have found out later." He shook his head. "No, I would have lost everything, not just my company, but my soul." They sat in silence for a moment, the breeze carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. Then Richard looked at Elena. "And you, young lady, what will you do next?" Elena smiled shyly. "I want to run the Alvarez Fund one day. Maybe even expand it to other countries." Richard's eyes shone. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." He leaned back in his chair, his voice warm but tired.